The earth didn't just crack, it screamed. In one breath, the eternal spring withered into ash. What began as a violent abduction became the sacred foundation of ancient religion. Leaving us to wonder, how does a stolen girl become the iron-willed sovereign of shadows? Welcome to Somnolent. We trace the evolution of Kore into Persephone, not as a tragedy, but as the most profound explanation for life, death, and the resilience of the human soul. To understand the rise of a queen who governs the silence of the grave, we must first look to a world that never knew a shadow. Before the heavy iron gates of the underworld ever creaked open, the earth existed in a state of relentless, golden stasis. This was the era of the Great Mother, Demeter, a time when the sun held a permanent seat at the center of the sky, and the idea of a dying leaf was as inconceivable as a setting sun. In this primordial landscape, there was no autumn to turn the hills to copper, no winter to shroud the valleys in white. There was only the green, the gold, and the exhausting brilliance of a perpetual noon. It was a world of aggressive abundance, where the soil was never permitted to rest and the roots were never allowed to sleep. At the center of this unyielding fertility stood Demeter. To the mortals who tilled the soil, she was the provider, the one who pulled life from the dirt with a flick of her wrist. But within the intimacy of the divine family, she was something far more complex. Demeter was not merely a mother, she was a force of nature that demanded total alignment. Her love for her daughter was a pressurized dome, a suffocating layer of protection that left no room for the girl to breathe on her own. Demeter saw every sprout, every flower, and every heartbeat of her child as an extension of her own power. This was a bond forged not just in affection, but in a desperate, clinging codependency. To the goddess of the harvest, her daughter was the ultimate crop, the only thing she could never allow to be harvested by the passage of time or the hands of another. And then there was the girl herself. At this stage of the story, she is a figure without a distinct silhouette. We call her Kore. In the ancient tongue, this was not a name, but a functional label, the maiden. It is the title for a woman who has no history of her own, a placeholder for a person who is yet to be defined by her own choices. In the eyes of the world, and certainly in the eyes of her mother, Kore was a pristine vessel, a reflection of Demeter's own radiant vitality. She moved through the high grasses as a ghost of her own potential, her agency surrendered to a mother who feared the very concept of change. She was the eternal daughter, trapped in a state of arrested development where she was never allowed to ripen and never allowed to decay. She was a masterpiece kept under glass, a goddess of nothing but her own innocence. The setting for the end of this innocence was the Nicean meadow. To an outsider, it was the pinnacle of earthly beauty, a lush, sprawling basin tucked away from the prying eyes of the other gods. But for Kore, it was a gilded cage of botanical wonders. The air here was heavy, thick with the intoxicating scent of wild thyme and the persistent hum of bees that never grew tired. The ground was a thicket of crocuses, violets, and irises, flowers that bloomed with such intensity they seemed to scream for attention. This was the specific geography of her isolation. Even when she walked with the daughters of the great ocean, Kore was fundamentally alone, watched over by the invisible, hovering presence of a mother who could not conceive of a world where her daughter was not within her reach. In this meadow, the tension of the eternal summer reached its breaking point. Demeter watched from the heights, her pride swelling as she saw her daughter playing among the pebbles. To the mother, this was the natural order. The girl remained a girl, and the world remained in bloom. But beneath the surface of the sun-drenched soil, something was shifting. The very perfection of the landscape had become a burden. For the girl without a name, every flower she picked was a reminder of the stagnation she lived in. The beauty was too loud, the light too constant. She was beginning to realize that in a world where nothing is ever allowed to die, nothing is ever truly allowed to live. She was a maiden waiting for a tragedy to give her a name, standing in a paradise that had become a prison of light. In the Nisaean meadow, the heat was rising, the scent of the lilies was becoming overbearing, and the earth beneath her feet was beginning to feel hollow, as if the very planet were holding its breath, waiting for the first shadow to finally fall. That hollowness beneath her feet was not merely a physical tremor. It was the weight of an ancient, silent sovereignty reaching up from the roots of the world. While the sunlight still kissed the back of Persephone's neck, she was already being watched by a gaze that had never known the warmth of a summer afternoon. To understand what was about to happen, we have to look away from the flowers and descend into the cold, quiet dark. We have to look at the man waiting in the silence. History has often been unkind to the Lord of the Dead. In our modern imagination, we tend to paint him in the flickering red hues of a Christian devil, a figure of malice, or a rebel seeking to overthrow the heavens. But to the Greeks, the master of the silent land was something far more complex and far more terrifying in his stillness. He was not a fallen angel or a tempter of souls. He was a bureaucrat of the inevitable. He was the warden of a house that everyone, eventually, must enter. His name was rarely spoken aloud for fear of drawing his attention, but when it was, he was often called the Rich One. This was not just a reference to the souls he collected, but to the physical wealth of the earth itself. Every vein of gold, every cluster of diamonds, and every ounce of iron belonged to him. He was the master of the hidden world, the steward of everything buried beneath the topsoil. Yet, despite his immense wealth, he was the most isolated of his brothers. Long before this day in the meadows of Nysa, the world was a jagged ruin of war. When the brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, finally overthrew their father and the older generation of gods, they stood among the wreckage of the cosmos to decide who would rule what. They did not vote, and they did not argue. They drew lots from a helmet. Zeus drew the sky, the high places of light and thunder. Poseidon drew the churning cycles of the sea, and Hades, the eldest, drew the short straw. He was handed the keys to the cellar of existence. He was given the land of shadow, the silent plains where the sun never rises and the wind never blows. While his brothers spent their days among the clouds or the waves, interacting with mortals and breathing the fresh air of the surface, Hades retreated into the absolute quiet of the deep. He became a god of boundaries, a solitary figure who ensured that the natural order was maintained, that those who died stayed dead. He was a king, but he was a king without a court of his equals. He was a husband with no wife to share the heavy burden of the scales. For eons he watched the world above from the periphery, a ghost in his own family. It is easy to imagine that this isolation bred a specific kind of hunger, not a hunger for blood or power, but for a presence that could survive the weight of his shadow. This is where the tragedy truly begins, in a moment of political negotiation rather than a sudden burst of violence. The story is often framed as a simple kidnapping, a predator snatching a victim from a garden, but the ancient texts reveal a much more uncomfortable truth. Hades did not act alone, and he did not act without permission. He had gone to his brother Zeus, the king of the gods and the father of the girl in the meadow. Hades had asked for a wife to sit beside him on his dark throne, and Zeus, ever the pragmatist, looked down at his daughter Persephone. He saw a girl who was the pride of her mother Demeter, but to Zeus she was also a piece on a board. He knew that Demeter would never agree to let her daughter descend into the earth. She would never allow the goddess of spring to live in the land of the winterless dead. So Zeus made a choice. He gave his brother a silent nod. He gave Hades his complicit permission to take what he wanted, provided he did it when Demeter wasn't looking.
This was not just a crime of passion by a lonely god, it was a cold, calculated transaction between brothers. The father sold the daughter to the uncle in a pact signed in the shadows. As Persephone reached for that final, shimmering flower, she wasn't just falling victim to a monster from the deep, she was falling into a trap set by the very people who were supposed to protect her. The earth beneath her was hollow because the foundations of her world had already been traded away. The invisible king was not stealing her, he was coming to collect a debt that had already been settled in secret. The shadow was not an accident, it was an appointment.
And on this afternoon, in the rolling meadows of Nysa, the appointment was finally kept. The day began with a deceptive warmth, the kind of heavy golden heat that makes the limbs feel slow and the heart feel safe. Kore was not alone, but she was solitary. She moved through the tall grass with the oceanid nymphs, her laughter blending with the rustle of the wind. To any observer, this was a scene of stagnant innocence, a snapshot of a life that would never change. But the earth beneath her feet was already conspiratorial. Gaia, the grandmother of all, had lent her silent consent to the plot. She had grown a lure, a biological trap designed with the precision of a predator. It stood apart from the lilies and the violets. It was a narcissus, but one that defied the laws of the natural world. From its single root, 100 heavy, fragrant blossoms erupted, glowing with a luminescence that seemed to pull the very sight from Kore's eyes. Its scent was not merely floral, it was an intoxicating weight, a perfume so thick it seemed to bridge the gap between the heavens and the salt spray of the sea. The gods above marveled at it, and the mortals below would have wept at its beauty. But it was grown for an audience of one. Kore felt the magnetic pull of the flower in her marrow. She drifted away from the safety of her companions, her sandals pressing into the soft loam as she moved toward the edge of the clearing. The air here felt different, thicker, colder, stripped of the meadow's easy oxygen. She reached out, her fingers trembling with a mix of wonder and an instinctual, unspoken dread. The moment her hand closed around the stem, the silence of the afternoon shattered. The sound was not a crack, but a deep tectonic groan, the noise of a world being unmade. The earth, which had been solid and certain beneath her for her entire existence, simply ceased to exist. In its place was a jagged mouth, a wound in the green skin of the meadow that bled darkness instead of blood. And from that wound came the gold. It was not the soft, restorative gold of the sun she had known. It was a cold, hard, subterranean gold, polished by the pressure of miles of overhead rock. The chariot emerged like a mountain rising from the sea, pulled by 4 horses that were less animals and more entities of shadow and iron. Their coats were the color of a moonless night, their eyes glowing with the dull red of cooling embers. They did not gallop, they surged, their hooves striking the air as if it were solid stone. At the reins stood the figure who had waited centuries for this specific second. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a king who had forgotten how to be human. His grip on the reins was effortless, his presence a vacuum that sucked the light out of the air. Before Kore could even form a scream, the chariot was upon her. The mechanics of the abduction were brutal and efficient. There was no struggle, only the sudden, violent displacement of her reality. His arm, cold as a winter grave and strong as a mountain root, wrapped around her waist and hoisted her from the blooming grass into the high, gilded seat of the machine. The transition was instantaneous and total. One moment, Kore's lungs were filled with the scent of wild thyme and the warmth of the Mediterranean sun. The next, she was breathing the dry, sterile air of the deep earth. The sun did not set. It was extinguished. As the horses plunged back into the abyss, the chariot tilted at an impossible angle, diving into the throat of the world. The psychological shock of the descent was a physical weight. The screaming nymphs on the surface were already becoming echoes, their voices thinned by the closing of the stone gates above. She looked back and saw the circle of blue sky shrinking, a dying star in a universe of black. Then, with a sound like a heavy door clicking shut, the blue vanished. The darkness of Erebos was not the absence of light, it was a presence. It pressed against her skin, heavy and damp, smelling of ancient dust, wet minerals, and the copper tang of stagnant time. The roar of the chariot's wheels against the obsidian floor of the underworld replaced the singing of birds. The heat of the upper world was replaced by a chill that didn't just touch her skin, but seemed to settle in her bones, claiming her. She was no longer the daughter of the harvest. She was a passenger in a vessel moving through a geography that did not care for the living. The golden chariot tore through the gloom, its lanterns casting long, distorted shadows against the jagged ribs of the cavern walls. Around her, the silence of the dead began to gather. This was the territory of the silent, the place where all things eventually end up, and she was entering it while her heart was still beating a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. He did not speak to her. He didn't need to. The sheer momentum of the descent told her everything she needed to know. The girl who had reached for a flower was gone, buried under miles of rock and the absolute will of the invisible king. As the chariot leveled out into the vast gray plains of the afterlife, Corey realized that the sun was not just gone for the night. For her, the sun was a memory of a different person, a girl who lived in a world where things grew upward toward the light. Here, in the hollows of the world, everything grew inward toward the dark, and she was now the most precious thing planted in its soil. While Persephone settled into the heavy velvet silence of the deep, a sound began to tear across the surface of the world. It was a cry that didn't just vibrate through the air, but through the roots of every tree and the marrow of every living thing. Demeter, the mother of the harvest, had heard her daughter's final shout, and the world was about to pay for the silence that followed. She had been just a moment too late, arriving at the meadow only to find the trampled flowers and the scent of ozone and sulfur lingering in the breeze. The earth had closed its mouth, leaving no trace of the chariot or the god who had stolen her heart's blood. For 9 days and 9 nights, Demeter refused to return to the heights of the divine peaks. She did not seek the counsel of the other gods, nor did she ask for their pity. Instead, she tore the silver veil from her hair and replaced her golden robes with the dark, dust-stained rags of a mourner. She took 2 great torches, lighting them at the fires of a volcano, and began a journey that would take her to the very edges of the known world. She wandered through the night, the flames casting long, dancing shadows against the hills as she called out a name that no one answered. She refused the taste of ambrosia and the cooling touch of water, allowing her immortal skin to dry and her eyes to grow hollow with exhaustion. She was a goddess looking for a ghost, and in her desperation, she began to forget that she was the one who kept the world alive. The land responded to her heartbeat with terrifying precision. When Demeter's heart hardened with anger, the soil beneath her feet turned to stone. The cycle of the seasons, which had once turned with the predictable grace of a clock, simply stopped. In the fields where golden wheat should have been swaying in the sun, there was only the rattle of dead stalks. The grapes shriveled on the vine into bitter, dusty husks before they could ever hold the promise of wine. Farmers who had spent their generations praying for the blessing of the rain now watched as the very spirit of growth abandoned the dirt. This was not a simple drought or a passing blight. It was the beginning of the Great Hunger. As she moved across the parched landscape, Demeter eventually found herself in the territory of Eleusis. By now, the radiant queen of the harvest was unrecognizable. She looked like an old woman who had seen the end of 1,000 lives, a wanderer named Doso who had no home and no kin.
She sat by the maiden's well, resting her aching limbs in the shade of an ancient olive tree. It was here that she encountered the daughters of the local king. Seeing only a grandmother in need of a place to rest, they took pity on her and brought her into the palace of the king and his wife Metanira. Inside the halls of Eleusis, Demeter lived in a state of quiet, simmering grief. She refused to eat or speak, sitting in a stony silence that unnerved the household. Even when she was finally coaxed into a brief moment of levity by the jests of a servant, the darkness never truly left her eyes. She took on the role of a nurse to the king's infant son, Demophion.
In her broken state of mind, she sought to replace what she had lost by forging something that could never be snatched away by the gods of the dead. Every night, while the palace slept, she would hold the human child in the heart of the hearth fire, burning away his mortality to make him a god. She wanted to create a being that was immune to the reach of the shadows. But when Metanira discovered the secret ritual and screamed in terror at the sight of her son in the flames, the fragile peace was shattered. Demeter stood tall, shedding her disguise as her true, terrifying form filled the room. Her golden light was so intense it seemed as though it might set the rafters ablaze. She did not want their gratitude, and she had no patience for their fear. She demanded a temple be built in her honor, a place where she could seclude herself from the sight of the sun and the company of the other gods. She withdrew into that sanctuary, and as she did, the final remnants of life on the surface began to flicker out. The earth became a graveyard. Oxen dropped in the middle of the furrows, unable to pull their plows through the parched, unyielding ground. The seeds buried in the earth stayed buried, refusing to sprout, as if they too were mourning with the goddess who had turned her back on them. This was the leverage of a mother's love. If Persephone was to remain in the dark, then the surface world would join her there in a slow, starving descent. The gods in their high palaces began to notice a change in the atmosphere. The smoke from sacrifices, which usually carried the scent of roasted meat and savory herbs up to the heavens, had vanished. There were no songs of praise, no offerings of the first fruits, and no libations poured into the soil. Humanity was starving to death, and as they died, the link between the mortal and the divine began to fray. Zeus, who had allowed the abduction to happen for the sake of a political arrangement with his brother in the dark, now faced a reality where there would be no one left to worship him. The grief of one mother had become the extinction event of an entire species. The stakes had moved beyond a family dispute. The world was dying, and the goddess of life was the one holding the blade. Demeter sat in her temple, watching the dust blow over the empty fields, waiting for the king of the gods to realize that he had underestimated the cost of her daughter's smile. The silence of the mortals soon became a deafening roar in the halls of Olympus. For weeks, then months, the aromatic smoke of burnt offerings had ceased to rise. The altars, once slick with the fat of prized cattle and stained with the sweetness of wine, grew cold and gray under a layer of settling ash. To the gods, this was more than a lack of respect. It was a loss of sustenance. They were beings fueled by recognition, by the interweaving of their wills with the lives of those below. Without the prayers and the sacrifices, the golden light of the mountain began to dim. The gods looked at one another with a growing, hollow anxiety, realizing that while they were immortal, a world without worshippers was a world where they were merely ghosts of their own grandeur. Zeus watched the horizon, hoping to see the green return to the valleys, but he saw only the relentless brown of a dying earth. He had thought Demeter's rage would be a brief storm, a mother's flare of temper that would eventually subside into the status quo. He had miscalculated the depth of a mother's grief. Demeter had not just walked away from her duties, she had severed the umbilical cord between the heavens and the earth. The political pressure among the Olympians reached a breaking point. Hestia looked upon the empty hearths of the world with sorrow, while the other deities clamored for Zeus to fix the disaster he had initiated with his secret pact. They knew the truth. If the humans died, the gods would follow them into a different kind of oblivion. The king of the gods finally understood that he could not command the harvest to grow while its mistress remained in mourning. He could not force the soil to be fertile through a lightning bolt or a decree. To save his dominion, he would have to do the one thing he loathed most. He would have to negotiate. He needed a bridge, a figure who could move between the light of the peak and the absolute dark of the abyss without losing his way or his mind. He called for Hermes. Hermes was the outlier of the family, the god of boundaries and the traveler of the forbidden paths. He was the psychopomp, the guide of souls, the only one among them who knew the layout of the underworld as well as he knew the corridors of the palace. While the other gods feared the heavy, airless weight of the lower world, Hermes moved through it with a thief's grace. Zeus gave him a single, desperate task. He was to go down into the house of Hades and convince the king of the dead to release the girl. It was no longer a matter of a marriage contract. It was a matter of cosmic survival. As Hermes tightened the straps of his winged sandals, the contrast between the two worlds had never been more stark. Above, the world was a cacophony of suffering. The wind howled through skeletal forests, and the cries of the starving rose up like a bitter chorus. The heat of the sun felt hollow, shining down on a planet that refused to respond to its touch. But as Hermes stepped off the edge of the world and began his descent, the noise began to fade. The air grew thick and cold, smelling of wet stone and ancient iron. The frantic energy of the dying earth was replaced by a terrifying, absolute stillness. Descending into the underworld was like sinking into deep water. The colors bled away until everything was a shade of obsidian or slate. There were no seasons here, no cycles of growth and decay, only the permanence of what has already passed. Hermes moved past the stuttering shadows of the newly dead who drifted like autumn leaves toward the banks of the Styx. He crossed the black water, where the only sound was the rhythmic dip of Charon's oar, and approached the gates of the silent palace. Inside, there was no chaos, there was no starvation. Hades sat upon his throne of polished ebony, a man who had never needed the prayers of the living to maintain his power. To Hades, the famine above was merely a boost in his intake, a surge in the population of his kingdom. He was patient, rooted in the earth like the very minerals he commanded. But beside him sat a figure who changed the entire geometry of the room. Persephone was no longer the girl in the flowered dress who had been snatched from the meadow. She sat in a chair of matching dark wood, her back straight, her eyes adjusted to the dim light of the cavern. The silence of the underworld seemed to emanate from her as much as it did from her husband. Hermes stood before them, the gold of his staff flickering in the low light. He looked at the king of shadows and the new queen, realizing that the diplomacy he had practiced on Olympus would not work here. He had come to bring a daughter back to her mother, but as he looked at Persephone's steady gaze, he realized he was looking at a woman who had begun to find a different kind of power in the dark. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the vaulted hall, and began the message that would decide the fate of the living world. But while the messenger spoke of the dying earth and the desperate prayers of humanity, the woman standing beside the throne was no longer the girl who had been taken from the meadows of Sicily. In the time it took for the seasons to fail above, something fundamental had shifted within her. To look at her now was to see a transformation that transcended mere survival. There was a common misconception that she spent her months in the darkness weeping, a captive bird beating its wings against the obsidian bars of a gilded cage. Yet the archaeological and literary evidence suggests a far more complex evolution.
She was shedding a skin that had grown too tight. Before the descent, she was simply Kore. In the ancient tongue, this name lacks any specific identity. It means the maiden, the girl, the daughter. It is a title defined entirely by her relationship to her mother and her lack of experience in the world. Kore was a creature of light and soft edges, a figure who existed in the periphery of the Olympian hierarchy. But the silence of the deep earth does not allow for such fragility. The darkness acts as a mirror, stripping away the expectations of the sun-drenched world and forcing an encounter with the core of the self. As the echoes of the messenger's voice drifted through the hall, Persephone did not look toward the surface with the longing of a prisoner. She stood with a posture that mirrored the granite pillars around her. She had discovered that in this silent dominion, she was not merely a guest or a victim, she was an architect of order. While Hades managed the logistics of the dead, it was Persephone who began to shape the emotional landscape of the afterlife. She found that her empathy, once directed at the blooming of a flower, could be sharpened into a blade of justice. The shift from Kore to Persephone is one of the most significant psychological arcs in all of mythology. The name Persephone carries a weight that Kore never could. Though its origins are debated, many interpret it as the bringer of destruction. It is a name that commands a specific kind of terror. In ancient Greece, people were often hesitant to speak it aloud, preferring to call her the Iron Queen or the Dread Goddess. This was not a title given to a helpless victim. It was a title earned by a woman who had looked into the void and decided to rule it. She began to see the underworld not as a place of punishment, but as a place of truth. Above, in the world of Demeter, everything was fleeting. Petals withered, seasons changed, and life was a frantic race against time. Below, everything was eternal. The souls that arrived at her feet were stripped of their titles, their wealth, and their pretenses. She saw them as they truly were. In this clarity, she found a sense of autonomy that the meadows could never provide. In the sunlight, she was a daughter to be protected. In the darkness, she was a judge to be feared. The dynamic between the king and his new queen also underwent a radical shift. Hades, often depicted as a stoic and isolated figure, found in Persephone a counterpart who possessed a cold brilliance that matched his own. They were not a master and a servant, they became a dual sovereignty. While other Olympian marriages were defined by infidelity and power struggles, the union of the shadows was characterized by a strange, somber stability. She was his equal in every sense, often appearing in ancient art as a figure of equal height and presence, holding the same scepter of authority. This was the birth of the Iron Queen. She learned to navigate the complex geography of the spirit, understanding that the darkness was not an absence of light, but a different kind of illumination. She began to wear the weight of her crown with a natural grace, her movements becoming measured and deliberate. The soft fabrics of her youth were replaced by the heavy, dark robes of a monarch. She had traded the ephemeral beauty of the spring for the enduring power of the earth's foundations. Philosophically, her transformation represents the necessity of the descent. It suggests that true wisdom and authority cannot be found in a state of perpetual innocence. To become whole, one must traverse the shadows. Persephone's journey is the archetype of the soul's maturation, the moment the child dies so that the adult can be born. She had mastered the art of being two things at once, the memory of the flower and the reality of the root. As she listened to the message from the upper world, she likely felt the pull of her mother's grief, but it was filtered through a new lens. She understood now that the earth needed the winter just as much as it needed the spring. She understood that death was the frame that gave life its meaning. She was no longer just a piece of the landscape. She was the one who controlled the boundaries. When the messenger finished speaking, the silence that followed was not one of submission. It was the silence of a ruler considering a petition. She looked at Hades, and in that shared glance, there was no fear, only a mutual understanding of the laws they had sworn to uphold. The girl who had tripped among the lilies was gone. In her place stood a woman of obsidian and iron, a queen who knew that her power did not come from the sun, but from the very ground that others feared to tread. She was ready to negotiate, not as a rescued daughter, but as a sovereign of the eternal dark. This was the moment she realized that she didn't just belong in the underworld belonged to her.
That sense of belonging was not a passive feeling. It was a physical commitment waiting to be sealed. As Persephone stood in the quiet halls of the Silent Kingdom, she faced a choice that would define the structure of the universe for eternity. The moment of the pomegranate seeds is perhaps the most scrutinized second in all of Greek mythology. It is the pivot point where the story shifts from a tale of abduction to a complex study of power, autonomy, and the weight of choice. To understand why these small, glistening seeds carry such gravity, one must first understand the fundamental laws of the fates. In the ancient logic of the world, the act of consumption is an act of binding. To eat the food of the dead is to accept the hospitality of the dead, and in doing so to become a permanent part of their foundation. It is a biological contract, a physical anchoring of the spirit to the soil from which the food grew. If you taste the fruit of the darkness claims a portion of your soul as its own. This was the law that Hermes faced when he descended from the golden heights of Olympus. He arrived with a mandate from Zeus to bring the girl home, a command meant to end the winter and appease the grieving Demeter. But when he entered the house of Hades, he did not find a prisoner pleading for a rescue. He found a woman who was already beginning to understand the leverage she held. It is here that the fruit appears. In the traditional interpretation, Hades is the master of deception. He knows that the decree of Zeus is absolute and that he must let his bride go. But he also knows the ancient law of the fates. He offers her the pomegranate, and in the old stories he does so with a whisper of false kindness or a hidden hand of pressure. This version of the myth paints Persephone as a victim one last time, a hungry, tired girl who is tricked into eating a few seeds, unaware that those tiny bursts of juice are actually chains that will pull her back to the shadows every year. However, if we move past the idea of the passive maiden, a far more compelling narrative emerges. Consider the woman Persephone had become during her time in the silent world. She had seen the truth of mortality. She had walked through the processing of souls and felt the immense power of the king who ruled beside her. She also knew exactly what waited for her on the surface. She knew the overwhelming, suffocating love of her mother Demeter, a love that left no room for growth or independence. Returning to the surface meant returning to the status of a daughter, a secondary figure in the bright court of her father, defined by her beauty and her utility to the harvest. By reaching out and taking those seeds, Persephone was not necessarily being fooled. She was making a calculated decision. She was taking out an insurance policy against her restoration to innocence. The pomegranate itself was no accidental choice. In the ancient world, it was a fruit of deep contradictions. Its skin is tough and leathery, hiding a treasure of blood-red seeds that are both sweet and tart. It was a symbol of fertility and marriage, but also of blood and the grave. By choosing to eat from it, Persephone was engaging in a ritual of self-initiation.
She took the fruit from the hand of Hades, and, with full knowledge of the world she was in, she consumed the seeds, one for every month she would eventually spend away from the light. Some say it was 3 seeds, others say 7, but the number is less important than the intent. Each seed was a nail in the coffin of her old life. She was staining her lips with the evidence of her new station. She was ensuring that she would never again be just the girl in the meadow. This act of eating is a silent rebellion. It is the moment she negotiates her own autonomy using the only currency the fates recognize, a permanent transformation. When she finally steps into the chariot of Hermes to begin the long climb back to the sun, she does so with a secret hidden in her belly. She knows that the reunion with her mother will be bittersweet, for she is no longer the same being who was snatched away. She has tasted the depths, and she has found that she has a hunger for it. This version of the story transforms the pomegranate from a trap into a bridge. It allowed her to satisfy the demands of her mother while maintaining the power she had discovered in the dark. She would give Demeter the spring and the summer, but she would keep the autumn and the winter for herself, ruling a kingdom where her mother's reach could never extend. The beauty of this myth lies in its silence. The ancient poets do not give us Persephone's internal monologue as she chews the seeds. They leave us to judge her by the results, and the results are clear. The girl who left the underworld was a queen. She returned to the surface not as a survivor of a crime, but as a diplomat from a foreign power. She carried the gravity of the silent world with her, a depth of character and a weight of authority that the other gods, for all their radiance, could never truly grasp. The law of the fates was satisfied, but it was Persephone who had manipulated the law to serve her own ends. She found the loophole in the cosmic order, turning a life sentence into a seasonal rotation. As the chariot ascended and the air grew warm with the scent of blooming grain, Persephone felt the seeds within her like a cold, comforting anchor. She was going back to the light, but she was bringing the dark with her. The deal was struck, and the balance of the universe had shifted. The girl who once gathered flowers was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that to truly own oneself, one must be willing to taste the bitter fruit of the unknown. As the gates of the lower world closed behind her, the era of the Queen of Shadows had truly begun.
The echo of the iron gates shutting served as a final punctuation mark to the old world. While Persephone sat upon her dark throne, a silent metamorphosis was occurring within her. But above the surface, the silence was of a far more terrifying nature. The earth had become a graveyard of ambition. Demeter, consumed by a grief that transcended her divine duties, had withdrawn her blessing from the soil. The stalks of grain withered into brittle straw, the orchards bore nothing but shriveled husks, and a biting frost began to claim the landscapes that once vibrated with golden light. This was the first true winter, though the mortals who shivered in its grip did not yet have a name for it. They only knew that the Great Mother had turned her back on them, and that the hunger was a hollow ache that would not be satisfied. Up on Olympus, the king of the gods watched as the smoke from sacrificial fires grew thin and eventually vanished. Without humanity, the gods were masters of a void, and Zeus realized that the stalemate between his sister and his brother could no longer be ignored. The abduction had become a crisis of cosmic proportions. He sent messengers, one after another, to the depths where the sun never reached, but the laws of the underworld were not easily bent, even by the Thunderer's will. It was then that the true weight of the pomegranate seeds became clear. Hades remained silent, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, for he knew that the ancient laws of the fates were on his side. To eat the food of the dead was to be anchored to the house of the dead. Persephone was no longer a visitor, she was a fixture of the foundation. Yet the world could not survive a perpetual winter. To resolve a conflict between the earth, the sky, and the grave, a mediator of ancient standing was required. Zeus turned to Rhea, the matriarch and the mother of the warring siblings, to bridge the gap between the light and the dark. Rhea descended into the shadows, her presence a soft luminescence against the obsidian walls of the palace. She did not come with threats, but with the wisdom of cycles. She saw the change in Persephone, the way the girl's eyes now held the depth of 1,000 secrets, and the way Hades looked upon her not as a captive, but as a partner in his heavy burden. The arbitration was delicate, a balancing act of divine rights.
Demeter demanded her daughter's total return, while the law of the pomegranate demanded her eternal presence in the dark. The compromise that emerged would reshape the very concept of time. It was decreed that the year would be split. For 1/3 of the journey of the sun, Persephone would occupy the throne beside Hades, ruling over the souls of the departed and tending to the roots of the world. For the remaining 2/3, she would ascend to the surface, returning to the arms of her mother and the warmth of the open sky. This was the birth of the seasons, the literal architecture of change. When the time comes for Persephone to descend, the transition is not marked by violence, but by a heavy, inevitable sadness. We see this today in the way the leaves lose their fire and the air turns sharp enough to draw blood. As she walks down the stone steps towards her husband's territory, Demeter's heart breaks anew.
Her sorrow manifests as the stripping of the trees and the hardening of the ground. The earth goes into mourning, falling into a deep, frozen sleep when nothing can grow and nothing can thrive. This is the price of the pomegranate, a period of barrenness that mirrors the emptiness of a mother's arms. But this dormancy is not a death, it is a waiting. Deep beneath the frost, Persephone is not suffering. She is reigning. She learns the language of the stones and the history of every soul that passes through her gates. She becomes the bridge between what was and what will be. And when the appointed months have passed, the gates of the underworld swing open once more. Her return to the surface is the first heartbeat of spring. The moment her foot touches the grass, the thaw begins. The sap rises in the trees, the first green shoots pierce the softening mud, and the air fills with the scent of wet earth and possibility. The reunion between mother and daughter is a force of nature so powerful it commands the flowers to bloom. Demeter's joy is the engine of the harvest, the heat of the summer sun, and the abundance of the fields. For those few months, the world is whole again, forgetting the cold that preceded it. Yet the bond between Hades and Persephone remains unbroken. Even in the height of midsummer, the Queen of Shadows carries the stillness of the underworld within her. She is the only deity who truly understands the necessity of the dark to appreciate the light. The compromise of Rhea did more than just settle a family dispute. It established a rhythm for all of existence. It taught the world that life is not a straight line, but a circle, that for every ending there is a descent, and for every descent there is a transformation that eventually leads back to the sun. The seasons are the physical heartbeat of this story, a recurring reminder that the queen must return to her shadows so that the world can eventually wake up again. While the world above ground watched the leaves fall and the stalks of grain wither, a much more private drama was unfolding within the walls of a sanctuary 14 miles northwest of Athens. This was Eleusis. To the uninitiated, the story of Persephone was a poem or a seasonal observation, but for those who sought the secret, it was the literal key to surviving their own mortality. For nearly 2,000 years, the most powerful and the most lowly members of society gathered here to undergo a transformation that they were forbidden to speak of under penalty of death. This was not a theater performance. It was a systematic shattering of the human fear of the grave. The myth of the Queen of Shadows ceased to be a story and became a religious dogma, a promise that while everyone must die, not everyone must suffer the same end. To understand how a story about a kidnapped girl became the most influential mystery cult in the ancient world, we have to look at the process of the initiation. It began with a long walk. Thousands of people, from Roman emperors to illiterate slaves, walked the sacred way from Athens to Eleusis. They carried torches, singing songs, but as they crossed the bridge over the Cephissus River, they were met with something unexpected: ritual insults. Masked figures would stand on the bridge and shout profanities and mockery at the travelers. This was a deliberate attempt to humble the ego, to strip away the social standing of the initiate before they reached the sanctuary. In the eyes of the Queen of Shadows, a king was no different from a beggar. Both were heading toward the same silent kingdom. Once they reached the sanctuary, the atmosphere shifted from the chaotic to the somber. They began a period of fasting, mimicking the grief of Demeter as she searched for her lost daughter. Hunger sharpened the senses and thinned the veil between the physical world and the spiritual one. It was in this state of exhaustion and heightened anticipation that they were offered the kikeon. This was a simple drink, a mixture of water, barley, and pennyroyal, but it is the subject of intense historical debate today. Many scholars believe the barley used in the sanctuary was infected with ergot, a fungus containing psychoactive alkaloids similar to those found in LSD. When the initiates drank from the cup, they weren't just participating in a symbolic toast, they were likely entering a profound, chemically induced state of altered consciousness. With the kikeon taking hold, the initiates were led into the telesterion, the great hall of initiation. Unlike a Greek temple where the rituals happened outside on an altar, the secrets of Eleusis happened indoors, in total darkness. The architecture was designed to disorient. Inside this massive square hall, hundreds of people sat in silence as the high priest, the Hierophant, performed the secret rites. We do not know exactly what was said or shown because the secret was kept for 2 millennia, but we do know the effect it had. Those who emerged from the telesterion spoke of a great light and a vision that changed their lives forever. They were no longer afraid of the dark. They no longer saw death as the end of the road, but as a transition to a place where Persephone waited, not as a jailer, but as a guide. This elevation of the story changed the very nature of Hades. In the common myths, the underworld was a place of gray shadows and mindless drifting.
But the Eleusinian mysteries promised something different for the initiates. They were told that because they had seen the queen's secret, they would be granted a place in the Elysian fields, a sunlit meadow of eternal spring hidden within the depths of the earth. The myth became a map. It gave the Greeks a sense of agency over the one thing they couldn't control. By walking in the footsteps of Demeter and witnessing the return of Persephone, the initiate felt they had conquered the finality of the grave. They had seen the grain die and rise again, and they believed their own souls would follow the same path. The secret revelations turned the Queen of Shadows into a figure of hope. She was the bridge between the two worlds. She was the one who knew the way back. For the people of the ancient world, the story provided a psychological safety net. It suggested that the descent into the underworld was not a fall into nothingness, but a return to a mother's embrace or a queen's protection. This wasn't just a tale to explain why the crops failed in winter. It was a sophisticated technology for the human psyche. It allowed people to live their lives without the paralyzing dread of what happens when the heart stops beating. The power of this dogma was so great that it survived the rise of empires and the fall of gods. When the sanctuary was eventually destroyed and the rites were outlawed, the core idea didn't vanish. It simply changed shape. The concept of a secret knowledge that saves the soul, of a descent into death followed by a triumphant return, and of a divine figure who holds the keys to the afterlife would echo through the religions that followed. The Eleusinian mysteries proved that the story of Hades and Persephone was never really about the gods at all. It was about us. It was about the human need to believe that even in the deepest shadows there is a light that never goes out, and a queen who remembers the way home. By the time the initiate left Eleusis, they were said to be twice born. They carried a piece of the shadow world back with them into the sunlight, and it made the colors of the living world seem more vivid. They understood that the seasons of the earth were a mirror for the seasons of the soul. The grain must be buried to live, the daughter must leave to return, and the human spirit must face the darkness of the underworld to truly understand the value of the light. This was the deep secret that turned a myth into a pillar of Western civilization. It wasn't just a story of a marriage or a kidnapping. It was a manual for the end of life, written in the language of the earth and the whispers of the queen who ruled it. As the sun set over the sanctuary and the initiates began their journey back to Athens, they did so with a quiet confidence. They had looked into the eyes of the shadows and found not a monster, but a mystery that made the world make sense. The queen was in her hall, the grain was in the soil, and for the first time, the dark was nothing to fear.
The shifting of the seasons is more than a biological cycle. It is a psychological architecture that anchors the human experience. When we look at the reunion of mother and daughter, we are not simply witnessing the return of the spring. We are observing the resolution of a fundamental tension that exists within every individual. Carl Jung suggested that myths are the collective dreams of a culture, and the story of Persephone is perhaps our most potent dream regarding the transition from the safety of childhood to the heavy responsibilities of the self. In the Jungian framework, the young woman begins as the chore. This word does not just mean girl, it implies a state of namelessness, an identity that has not yet been forged by the trials of life. In the beginning, Persephone is an extension of her mother. She exists in a world of perpetual sunshine, a garden where nothing ever changes and no one ever grows old. To stay in that garden is to remain a child forever. It is a psychological stasis that prevents the soul from reaching its full potential. The appearance of Hades, then, is not merely an external threat, but a psychological necessity. He represents the first encounter with the dark, the unknown, and the weight of mortality that pulls the child away from the parent. For the daughter to become a woman, the mother's world must be broken. This is the core of the mother-daughter dyad. Jung and his colleague Carl Carinian argued that Demeter and Persephone are essentially two versions of the same being. Demeter is the woman who has given birth and knows the weight of loss. Persephone is the woman who is yet to be. They represent the past and the future of the feminine soul, locked in a cycle where one must descend so the other can eventually rise. This separation is often painful, and the myth does not shy away from that agony. Demeter's grief is the archetypal mourning of every parent who realizes their child is no longer an extension of themselves. Her rage against the earth is the resistance we all feel toward time and change. Yet, the myth insists that this grief is the price of evolution. Without the abduction, there is no harvest. Without the descent into the dark, there is no depth to the personality. The maiden must be lost so that the queen can be found. When Persephone emerges from the underworld, she is no longer the nameless chore. She has tasted the pomegranate, a symbol of the knowledge that once gained cannot be forgotten. She has integrated the shadow. This leads us to the striking dual nature of her figure in Greek thought. To the poets of the surface world, she was the innocent bride, the victim of a divine struggle who brought the flowers back to the fields. But to the initiates of the ancient mysteries, she was the Iron Queen, the one who sits beside the king of the dead and holds the power of life and death in her hands. She was a figure more feared than her husband, for she was the one who decided which souls would find peace and which would wander. This duality mirrored the reality of women in the ancient world. In the public square, the Greek woman was expected to be like the chore, silent, submissive, and protected. But within the walls of the home, in the sanctity of the ritual, she was the matriarch, the one who understood the secrets of lineage, survival, and the spirit.
Persephone gave a face to this hidden power. She proved that a woman could walk in both worlds, the bright world of the living and the silent world of the ancestors. The genius of the myth lies in its refusal to offer a simple resolution. Persephone does not return home permanently, nor does she remain a prisoner. Instead, she creates a third way. She establishes a rhythm.
her life becomes a series of departures and returns, a constant negotiation between the light of her mother's love and the darkness of her own sovereign domain. This is the ultimate goal of the psychological journey, not to stay in the sun forever, but to learn how to navigate the shadows without losing one's way back to the light. By accepting her role as the queen of the underworld, Persephone transforms from a passive object of a story into its most complex protagonist. She becomes the bridge between the physical world of growth and the spiritual world of the soul. She teaches us that maturity is not the absence of darkness, but the ability to carry that darkness within us as a source of strength. Ultimately, the myth tells us that we are all like the grain. We must be buried in the cold, dark earth to truly understand what it means to reach for the sky.
That burial is not an end, but a necessary pause. For thousands of years, this cyclical movement between the surface and the deep has mirrored our own human experience. Yet the way we perceive the Queen of Shadows has shifted as dramatically as the seasons she commands. In the ancient world, the story of Hades and Persephone was a sacred secret, protected by the silence of the Eleusinian mysteries. Those who walked the path from Athens to Eleusis were not looking for a romance, but for a way to live without the paralyzing fear of what comes after the final breath. They saw in Persephone a guide, someone who had traversed the boundary and returned, proving that even in the deepest silence of the earth, there is a promise of renewal. To the ancients, she was the dread goddess, a figure of awe and respect who understood the weight of the crown she wore alongside her husband. As the centuries unfolded, the narrative began to evolve, moving from the temple to the canvas and eventually to the written page. In the Renaissance and the Romantic era, artists focused on the drama of the abduction, painting a scene of chaos and divine struggle. But in our contemporary era, the story has been reclaimed once more. The modern retelling often strips away the terror of the underworld, replacing it with a narrative of autonomy and hidden power. We see Persephone not as a kidnapped girl, but as a woman who looked at the cold, lonely throne of the dead and decided she would rather rule there than remain a perpetual child in the sun-drenched meadows above. We have grown fascinated with the idea of the misunderstood god of the shadows. In popular fiction and modern media, Hades is no longer the frightening jailer, but a brooding architect of a quiet kingdom, and Persephone is the only one capable of softening his heart. This romanticization speaks to a collective desire to find comfort in the unknown. We want to believe that the darkness is not a place of punishment, but a place where we can truly be seen, away from the expectations of the world above. We find a strange peace in the image of the pomegranate seed, the choice to stay, the choice to belong to the shadows, and the recognition that one can be both the creature of the spring and the ruler of the night. This enduring fascination proves that the myth is more than a simple explanation for the changing of the leaves. It is a psychological map of the human soul. We all have our winters. We all have moments when we feel pulled beneath the surface of our lives, away from the warmth of the familiar. The legacy of Hades and Persephone teaches us that these descents are not failures, they're essential. The grain must experience the stillness of the soil before it can summon the strength to break through the crust of the earth. Without the heavy, cold pressure of the dirt, the roots would never take hold, and the stem would have nothing to anchor its reach toward the clouds. In the modern world, we are often told to avoid the dark, to stay forever in the light of productivity and noise. But the story of the Queen of Shadows stands as a quiet defiance to that pressure. It reminds us that there is a specific kind of wisdom found only in the depths. There is a strength that is forged in the silence of the underworld, a clarity that only comes when the distractions of the sun are stripped away. To understand this story is to understand that we cannot have one half of the year without the other, and we cannot have the fullness of our own character without acknowledging the parts of ourselves that dwell in the shade. As we look at the legacy of this ancient union, we realize that the light and the dark are not enemies, but partners in the grand design of existence. To love the flower is to respect the soil. To cherish the bloom is to honor the decay that feeds it. Here at Somnolent, we embrace this necessity of the descent. We recognize that sleep, much like the winter, is the sacred ground where our spirits are replenished and our visions are sown. Without the rest, there is no growth. Without the shadows, there is no way to measure the brilliance of the sun. As you close your eyes and feel the pull of the deep, remember that you are not losing the day, you are preparing for the next. You are the grain resting in the earth, waiting for the turn of the wheel. Because in the end, the story is clear. Without the descent, there is no bloom.